And we're live.
Good afternoon from London. My name is Geoffrey Nice. I'm chairman of the Uyghur Tribunal, and I'm sitting here in London with Hamid Sabi, counsel to the tribunal. And I'm joined online by other members of the tribunal to hear this afternoon two and possibly two more witnesses. I'll deal with the first witness and then I'll deal with the other witnesses after his evidence is finished. The first witness is Dr. Ton Zwaan, and let me explain in a way how his evidence comes about, he having been called by the tribunal, and in a way it being entirely my fault that he or somebody dealing with these issues wasn't called as a witness in either the June or September hearings. It's just possible that some of you may remember that I asked one of the witnesses giving evidence about the law of genocide, whether it would be accurate to say that the concept of genocide was initially a sociological concept, and in Venn diagram terms, it was quite a large circle, and that the legal definition of genocide came after the sociological concept was formed and was a smaller circle within that, if you like, Venn diagram. And the witness accepted that. But that's hardly enough to give us an evidential base on which to have some understanding of the sociological concept of genocide. And so I realized a bit late in the day that it would help us if we could hear from Dr. Zwaan, and he very kindly agreed at short notice to provide us with a paper, which will be on the website as soon as this evidence hearing is finished, and to talk to us today. Dr. Zwaan is a retired associate professor of social science and genocide studies at the University of Amsterdam. He has written extensively on this subject, and he's given evidence in various places, including at the Yugoslav Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and in the case of Slobodan Milosevic. And I'd ask Dr. Zwaan if you'd be good enough, please, to start off with a summary of what it is you've explained for us in your paper, and then no doubt I and my colleagues will have further questions to ask of you. Dr. Zwaan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start with a few observations. Genocide is a complex and difficult concept. Its use is often surrounded by confusion about its meaning. It's also frequently used in a fairly loose sense in general public discourse, in the press and other media, and by politicians and activists of various backgrounds. Moreover, for many people, it is a term loaded with moral, political, personal, and emotional meaning. Because a precise use of the term is desirable, so in the first section of my note, I have discussed shortly two meanings. The original broad meaning as formulated by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, and the legal meaning or definition given in the United Nations Convention. For you, the legal meaning is decisive, but I feel it's important for a better understanding to try to imagine genocide in a wider historical and sociological sense. Genocide, then, is best considered as a complex, large-scale, organized and systematic process of persecution and destruction. Not always, but nearly always, genocide is an activity, a policy of a state, in legal terms, a state crime. There are two fundamental reasons for this. In the modern world, only the state disposes of the required resources and means of organization, bureaucracy, for such an undertaking. And only the state, itself based on a monopoly of violence, has to require means of violence to execute such a process. Scale is important in this context. If the target group, the victim population, numbers 1 million people or more, usually several 100,000 people, the persecutors or perpetrators are necessary for the planning, organization, coordination, and execution of the genocidal process. Genocide is an enormously massive phenomenon. The perpetrator should not be seen as a single homogeneous category. In the field of genocide studies, often 3 levels are distinguished. A central or top level of a small group of leaders. They initiate, launch, and steer a genocidal campaign. Then a middle level of officials who do most of the more detailed planning, coordination, and organization. And lastly, a lower level of regional and local officials, commanders, troops, and others who carry out the dirty, violent work of the genocidal campaign. Arbitrary mass arrests, deporting, detaining, and guarding people in camps and prisons. Forced labor, abuse, humiliation, starvation, various forms of torture, and in the most extreme cases, the actual killing of victims. All these people, linked to each other, fulfill different functions in the overall genocidal process, but together they drive the process on, and they are, in a general sense, collectively united behind the aims of the genocide. In the second section of my note, I shortly discussed genocide in the past. As argued there, genocidal processes flow primarily from a fateful combination of ideological convictions and well-nigh unlimited political power. I would like to add here that notwithstanding substantial differences between ideologies and political regimes from case to case, genocide scholars have often found that already existing collective hate fantasies about target groups shared between political leadership and parts of the general population may contribute substantially to the unleashing of genocidal campaigns. A last comment. I would like to emphasize that in trying to imagine and understand the dynamics of genocidal process, it is essential to focus on the motives and activities of the perpetrators on the 3 distinguished levels. Without them, there would be no genocide. But at the same time, it is crucial to keep a keen eye on the experiences of the victims by trying to understand their fate in all horrible detail. The deeply destructive and evil nature of genocide may be laid bare. I thank you for your attention. I cannot hear.
You're muted.
I was muted, I'm now unmuted, I hope. Thank you very much, Dr. Zwaan. I'm going to look to my colleagues first to see if any of them has got a question that any one of them would like to ask. Yes, Professor Kumar.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Zwaan, thank you very much indeed for your article and also the very nice description. As you say, genocide is very complex, and I think trying to get one's head around it is quite difficult. You said that the legal definition of intent, and I want to talk a little bit about intent, is often conscious and well considered. You also said we should be looking at genocide in a more sociological point of view, and you also described the genocide in the last century. However, you do then warn us, saying that a strong focus on intentions is not very fruitful. So I just wondered perhaps if you could just give us a little bit more detail about why you say that, and whether we should, in fact, I mean, in a way, ideology is intent. So I just wondered whether you could just push that a bit forward for us. Thank you.
In trying to answer that question, First of all, I don't believe that ideology has the same meaning as intent. Ideology is an overall complex of leading ideas, but there can be a great distance between the ideas and the actual activities of people. And I think the concept of intent is very much focused on the individual activities of individual people. And my point is that if you focus on that, you will be confronted with severe problems. Let me give an example. In the 30s, it was often alleged in German National Socialist publications and speeches that the Jews should be eradicated from Germany. That's an ideological statement. But the actual practice of driving away the Jews and later on killing them only came years and years later. And it's very hard for a tribunal and for lawyers to prove intent. So I feel it's more often useful to deduce intent from what is actually going on the ground. That's my point. I don't know if I satisfied you, but
partly, but thank you.
Well, before I see what other questions there are, it's very interesting in your paper and quite challenging for lawyers, Dr. Zwaan, to see that you almost say that proving intention is impossible in the legal sense, or very difficult. And I think you've touched on that now already. Anything you want to add on the basis of what you've written about the lawyer's difficulty or focus on intent?
The difficulty with intent is, as you know, it can be very easily denied, and intent, if phrased at all, is very difficult to pin down. Let me give you one example. When the Chinese president states in his speeches and documents also that his aim is a rejuvenation of the Chinese people and of China itself, or if he states that, for instance, it is important to strengthen the Chinese element in the border areas of China, you can say these are very vague and general statements behind which might be hidden many different policies and many different actions. So it's very often very difficult to prove intent in a decisive way, in my opinion. That's it, first round.
Yes, thank you. I could have a supplement to that, but I want to see if anybody else wants to come in now on this issue. Yes, Mr. Vetch.
I have a question here from Professor Manji, who is unable to, we can't hear her voice. So Dr. Zwaan, can Dr. Zwaan elaborate on how we might begin to construct a victim-centered analysis to reveal genocide? Can we learn from other areas of law, e.g. in studying violence against women, and what are the pitfalls if their accounts are simply disbelieved and the victims blamed?
That's a very complicated question. There's many different sides to it, but let me try. I do not believe in a perpetrator-centered analysis of genocide, nor in a victim-centered analysis of genocide. Because to understand what is going on, you have to focus on the interaction between the perpetrators on the one side and the victims on the other. The dynamics of genocide is centered in that relation. So I don't see any point to say that we should focus on one side or another. That's one point. The next one is, I think we can learn from all cases of genocide, and also maybe from, for instance, other forms of atrocities, mass murders, pogroms, deep discrimination of women, as happens in some situations, that we can learn all the time a better understanding of genocidal processes. But I would like to see that in a wide sense. I mean, as said, I do not believe on a victim-centered analysis only. I don't know whether this is satisfying, but this is how.
Well, Dr. Manji nodded her head, so I think we can accept that you've got part of the way there. Can I come back to and see if she's got another question in writing, and then we'll pick up on that, and from anybody else. But your earlier answer, Dr. Zwaan, about, I think, if I'm summarizing it reasonably accurately, a multiplicity of objectives.
Yes.
Is something that might be recognized in the law, where it would be said objectives are not relevant to the question of the legal intent required for genocide, because that intent is critical at the moment of delivery of whatever it is that causes genocide. Now, that doesn't mean, I think, delivery of the bullet by the person actually operating the state policy, but it means the state policy that leads to the use of the bullet, for example. Do you see that as a helpful or unhelpful distinction for us to draw, who have to be dealing with the legal definition of intent, a difference between a possible multiplicity of objectives and the intention at the moment a particular policy is put into play, put into force?
Maybe there are some possibilities there. I would like to state, firstly, that there usually are many different policies together. I mean, genocide is a composite or a very complex phenomenon, and many different policies might be required also by the perpetrators. For instance, demographic engineering might be one way to attack a target group. Like, for instance, when in a case, people are on a large scale deported out of certain areas and replaced by other population groups, as happened, for instance, in the western part of Poland at the beginning of the 40s, when many Poles and Jews naturally were deported from the west of Poland and replaced by so-called Volksdeutsche, people from German background, and they took over their houses and farmsteads and jobs. So that can be one policy, but next to that, there can be a policy of concentration and taking away the possession of people. They're losing their rights in a systematic way, and they might be killed. And all these policies usually go together. So to understand the complexity of genocide, it's important to have an open mind about the composite of aims which form the genocide. I don't know whether I answered your question, but
You most certainly did. And following on from that composition of, I think, 5 items that you've given us. In composition, is that the sort of material that would lead a sociologist to say sociological genocide has been committed or may have been committed, not because of just one, but because of the combination of actions and policies?
Certainly, yes.
And you, yeah.
I
That's
I
very
think,
helpful, actually. I mean, it may not be helpful because we are dealing with a legal problem, but it's very helpful in a broader understanding.
yeah, well, that's what my aim is. I mean, to think in a wider sense than only a legal sense. But
Yes.
okay.
I think Professor Kaur has a question for us. Professor Kaur.
Thank you for being here. So I would like to explore in the wider sense, if you seem to be having a contradictory situation where on the one hand, a group seems to be targeted on the basis of their ethnicity or religion, and on the other hand, you have, it seems, a situation where they are also celebrated in terms of promoting ethnic diversity, for instance, and even a policy of intermarriage, which might be seen as forced or coercive marriage. So how would you begin to explain that kind of situation? Thank you.
Could you please give me an example of a specific case or?
Yeah, the example is some of the evidence that we're looking at in Xinjiang in northwest China regarding the Uyghur people.
Maybe I should say you should never be surprised by the complexity of a process of genocide. I would like to give an example. If you look at what is often called the Holocaust, and you look at it in more detail, you will find out that the fate of the Jews in about 16 different countries, occupied, non-occupied, is quite different. And also the policies which were followed to persecute people show enormous differences. Also the way to destroy them. I mean, people usually think that Jews were killed in gas chambers, and that's largely true, but only for half of the victims. Most of the other ones were shot next to the places where they lived, in the cities and towns. You all know about Babi Yar, for instance, in Kiev. So don't be surprised if you see differences between events and developments in one case, and you see different policies existing next to each other. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
So is it like a kind of veiling or the coding that you talked about in your paper?
Sorry?
Is it another way of coding or veiling or distracting from what might be seen as a genocide?
Well, a regime or the perpetrators themselves will usually do their best to deny what they are doing in public and also dress it up by propaganda means or plain lying or deceiving people in realizing their aims. I mean, many Dutch Jews, to give another example, sincerely believed that they would go to the East and work there under the surveillance of German police. They did not know at all that they would be instantly killed within a few hours if they arrived at Auschwitz, or many of them would be killed, not everyone, when they arrived in Auschwitz or in Sobibor or at other places. So deceiving the victims and also the larger public is usually a very important part of every genocidal process, because there are quite some reasons, but one very important reason is to surprise the victims and hold them into the dark before they realize what is really going to happen to them. And then it's often too late. So making up stories about what is going on is very usual in all cases and is done by perpetrators or by the perpetrating regime, political regime. And they will always deny. Also, maybe to mislead themselves, or you might think that the psychological function of misleading is also to help the perpetrators to believe, or let me say, not to realize what they are really doing. I don't know if this is helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. Please.
Mr. Clark. You may be muted, Mr. Clark.
I can't hear his voice, sorry.
I think he's muted.
Mr. Clark, you're muted.
Sorry, apologies. Professor, thank you. Two things which I hope are not oversimple questions. One is, and you touched on it in your last answer, was to what degree is it necessary that the perpetrators appreciate or understand what they are doing? Is that presumably if they are intending it, they need to understand what the objectives are? You talked a little a second ago about deluding themselves through the stories that are necessary to disguise, at least from the victims. But whether for themselves, if they delude themselves, is that at all relevant to them? And secondly, in your introduction, you mentioned a few times the concepts of violence and destruction. And I just wondered, from a sociological point of view, and I think I know what you're going to say about this, but I wanted to ask you, what actually does destruction mean in the context of genocide to you as a sociologist?
Well, thank you for the question. First, about delusion, you should realize that all the people involved, and that might be hundreds of thousands of people involved in carrying out genocidal process, very often do not realize the totality of that process, but they see their own part. Let me just give an example again from persecution of the Jews. For instance, the Masons who were building gas chambers, well, they had a job to do with an overseer and a plan and an aim. But it has been proven that many of them did not realize what they were actually constructing. This can be extended, this point, about troops, policemen, vigilante groups, all sorts of participants who only see their own, let's say, contribution in the overall division of labor and do not realize at all what is going on. Only a part of the real perpetrators down on the ground realize what's going on. That's one point. The other point about destruction, I use that term because it's important to understand that from case to case and from time to time, what it means destruction is different. I mean, if we take away the rights of a certain group of people, that will hurt them, but it will hurt them up to a point. Many people think, well, maybe I can make the best of it. I'll try and hold out and let's keep secret how we struggle and so forth and so on. But there are so many different forms of destruction And the ultimate form naturally is killing people.
Yeah.
But that also may take very many different forms, and also did so in different cases. And destruction, the use of the term is that it enables you to see all forms of destruction running from, let's say, everyday discrimination or just harassments on the street or elsewhere, till the other side of the spectrum, and that's the actual killing of people. And there is a whole range of activities between that. I hope to have answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you, yes.
Okay.
Mr. Rowe.
Hello.
Hello.
You mentioned that already existing hate fantasies against groups may contribute to the onset of a genocidal process. And I'm wondering, from your work, whether you could tell us a bit more about how the state might then stoke those existing fantasies. I mean, what I'm thinking about here is a narrative that we've heard a lot about terrorism, Uyghur terrorist acts, which there were, becoming presented as a sort of systematic pattern of rampant violence, and of course that which would seem to rather overstate the situation as it was. So I'm just, yes, if you could just tell us a bit more about how the state takes an existing fantasy or even an existing fear and works on it.
Yes, well, I will try. By a collective hate fantasy, we may understand a complex of prejudice, beliefs, hostile ideas about a certain target group. And it is collective because it is shared between many people, and also because it very often has a long history. To give an example, China is a very old civilization, and Chinese, for many centuries, have seen all other people who are not Chinese as barbarians. And barbarians should be treated with suspicion, and you should take care that you don't deal with them. This is a very generally shared belief about foreigners or Chinese people. So if you look at present-day Chinese nationalism, there is certainly a clear racist streak about that, or in it, because in principle, non-Chinese are seen as barbarians. When the Chinese moved west, they were confronted with Mongols, with Uyghur, with Kazakhs, with Tibetan people, who are all not Chinese. And there is a very long tradition of seeing these people as possibly invading barbarians, which could hurt the Chinese. Now, I'm nearly certain that this very old-fashioned belief, which is largely shared, is also behind the present policies towards the Uyghur, for instance, because they are seen as dangerous foreigners. The same you can argue about many other cases. Anti-Semitism is maybe the most well-known collective hate fantasy in the West. And this has very old roots. I mean, it's more than 1,000 years you can trace anti-Semitism in European societies, with also regular outbursts of pogroms, forms of persecution, killings, excluding people, driving them away. And this has gone on for over 1,000 years, till the 20th century, when it came to its ghastly culmination point. But these sorts of beliefs are generally available in cultures, and sometimes people are indoctrinated with that. To give another example, in Chinese history, recent history, there have been great humiliations for China. For instance, the Opium Wars, and also the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, but especially the attack of Japan, fascist and militaristic Japan, on the Chinese mainland. Chinese school children today learn about these events, about the horrible humiliations of China in the past. Now, as you can imagine, if you learn that when you're small, you will think, well, we should be strong and stand up against these evil forces from the outside, and we should attack them if necessary, or at least defend ourselves as best as we can. Well, I hope I have explained a bit the idea of collective hate fantasies and the role they may have in unleashing genocide. People are afraid very often of other nations or other groups, and this might be used by ruthless politicians to mobilize feelings against these foreigners. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a small addition to that, if there is this view of foreigners building a story that Uyghur terrorism is instigated by foreigners, would underpin this particular view that might be stoked.
Well, it might be a combination of present-day happenings and events, like every society today in the world. There is a large fear of terrorism, and in the case of China, there's also fear of separatism, and there is the idea of Islam as being a radical or dangerous religion. These ideas are also known in the West. I suppose everybody knows that. And they are in the press and in the mass media. And what you see is a combination of these recent events with longer standing prejudices against foreigners who might be behind all sorts of evil. David Farage is referring to an invasion of foreigners on our beaches. He is appealing to very old fears among inhabitants of the British Islands that there might come some invasion by some foreign, and it's completely ridiculous, it's unfounded. But you should never underestimate how easy it is, relatively speaking, how easy it is to stir up fears, collective fears among people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zwaan. I have one question. What if the genocidal intent or whatever intent is behind it is wrapped up in a positive approach, like saying that balancing the population, which does not exclude the existence of the Uyghurs or other nations, but adds to that Han-Chinese to just balance the population in an area where there is very little Han-Chinese population there. They do carry out their hate approach and all these things, but on the top of it, they say the policy is to balance the population in the area, and that on its own is a positive approach rather than negative scaremongering policy.
Well, I'm not quite sure whether I understand your question properly, but it will be presented by a perpetrator regime always that they are acting in a positive way. I mean, if the Chinese leadership states we are strengthening the Chinese element in the border regions, many common Chinese, they don't know what's really going on, will see that as a very positive approach, as you call it. But don't forget the enthusiasm among Germans, for instance, when it was announced that Germany would be freed of Jews. I mean, what is positive is a relative concept and can be interpreted in many different ways. And I think you should take care by distinguishing between so-called positive and negative approaches, but look at the real complexity of genocidal processes. I don't know whether I answered your question.
Thank you.
I think if I can just follow that on, because it was something that was concerning me. If you, in any particular circumstance, found that of the motivating factors, one was genuine and was not infected by genocidal intent, and others were, would you be able to handle such a complex of motivations?
Is there a certain example you're thinking about?
Well, China may well be an example, because there's quite a lot of evidence that will suggest their security concerns may be as realistic as the security concerns of countries like our own facing terrorists, for example. Or there might be a genuine interest in getting a mixing of ethnicities by intermarriage. They may be genuine. How would that affect your overall view of things if one or more than one were genuinely non-genocidal?
Maybe to take up one of your points, every state naturally has to fight terrorism or illegal violence within its own borders. But fighting terrorism is a specialty, requires intelligence, requires special agents, requires spies, and a very thorough organization of trying to attack the terrorists which are to be attacked. That is something that might be a genuine aim of a government or a state. But it's quite something else than declaring collectively a minority as a threat, because some members of that minority are engaged in terrorism. There have been some terrorist incidents, as we all know, by radical Uyghurs in the past years. And that's a form of fear. And that terrorism should be countered. I can see that. But present policies are not countering terrorism, but they are declaring minorities as terrorists, all of them, guilt by association. And we can see the same, for instance, in how people, the general public, many people think Islam is dangerous today. That's not because they know a lot about Islam, but because there have been some attacks by IS and other Al-Qaeda, as we all know. And then these perpetrators, these terrorists, are seen as standing for a very much larger issue, namely Islamic beliefs and practices and Islamic people. And there you see the mechanism of collective hate fantasy again. Instead of focusing on countering terrorism, the general public focuses on Islam. And everybody who is Islam or an Islamic citizen might then be seen as a dangerous threat. And there you see the difficulty of differentiating between genuine policies by states and larger mechanisms of seeing a threat in certain minorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Ostler, please.
Thank you. I'd like to go back, please, to the concept of delusion. And you've talked about delusion of the victims and of the perpetrators. And we're dealing with genocide within an international framework when we're dealing with the legal case. And I wonder if you could say something in terms of sociological understanding and delusion in relation to the international community.
I think in international politics and in relations between states, there is continuous an element of, let's say, propaganda to emphasize their own qualities and propagate their own aims as reasonable or realistic. So I think there is an element of delusion very often in international politics, and nearly all states, as far as I know, have untruthful aspects to their way of operating. I mean, a trivial example, when Boris Johnson is talking all the time about the French who do not stop the foreign invading, the foreign people who go with small boats across the channel, he's trying to do two things: to hide the activities of the British government, or the lack of activities on the one hand, and at the same time blaming other people for what is happening. I do believe you see this very often in international politics. And well, the main problem is maybe a problem of truth. I mean, are people ready and willing to speak the truth in a certain rational and rationalistic, realistic sense? Or are they lying? Might be as simple as that. And maybe on a daily level, we all try to do our best and show our best sides. And maybe the darker sides of people, most people will try to hide them. Or that's so I believe. I don't know. I see you smiling, but I don't know whether you got an answer.
No, I was just thinking it in terms of the legal consequences of genocide, because governments are required to act if genocide is found. And I was just trying to understand this question in relation to the genocide. I was thinking about it in relation to the Genocide Convention and how that might be understood.
Well, let me just add one remark. Alas, the Genocide Convention has been mostly a dead letter in the past 70 years.
Mm.
Between 1948, when it was accepted, and the beginning of our century, there are only two spurious cases of states which have had the courage to accuse others of genocide. One example which is in my mind is Vietnam, when it occupied, so-called liberated Cambodia. They took the trouble to say, well, the Cambodian regime was a genocidal regime. But all the years before that, before 74, no state in the world made any objections to what was going on in Cambodia. And they were strongly supported by China and secondly by Russia. We see very often an enormous degree of not willing to act on the basis of the convention. You remember Darfur, all of you, 2003, 2004. More than 300,000 people were killed probably, or lost their lives. Several states declared, well, yes, this is genocide, but then it's up to the African Union to solve that. I mean, America did, for instance, and Europe officially did not acknowledge what happened in Darfur as genocide. So you see very often this whole political game, I would say, in acknowledging things or denying things or keeping quiet. Thank you.
Dr. Zwaan, thank you very much. You've still got 9 minutes if we want to use it. But first of all, Mr. Vetch.
No, carry on, Sir Geoffrey.
No, I was only going to give Dr. Zwaan an opportunity to wrap up if he felt we'd missed things. So please ask your question.
Okay. Dr. Zwaan, you talked about the 3 layers of authority, central, middle, and lower. The tribunal has heard significant and large amounts of evidence, which it may or may not accept, of torture, rape and sexual violence, and other mistreatment of the Uyghurs. Could you say a little bit about what that might, how that might inform about the intent of the senior people who presumably were the originators of policy? Is it, in your experience or in the studies that you've made, likely that the specifics of those actions will have been promulgated and ordained from above? And lastly, what is the point of it?
The last question is the most difficult, but let me first say these 3 levels, you should see maybe that the highest level is empowering a lower level, the middle level, and that is empowering in its turn the lowest level, the people on the ground who do the dirty work. A genocide is launched by the highest level in a very general sense. They might just say, let's get rid of this population, or let's subject that target group. Might be very general decisions. On the lower level or on the middle level, people will start working out plans. And there is not so much a plan as Lemkin implied, but it's more a question of learning by doing and making plans and see whether they succeed in attaining aims. And then the lowest level has, in a sense, also the lowest responsibility. They just get their orders or their commands from local leaders, from local commanders, from local heads of police. Go and arrest so-and-so, or bring that sort of people to prison. Rules for torture or for very horrible mistreatment and abuse are generally not formulated by the people on the lowest level, but they get, how do you say that in English? They receive a sort of general power to collect, for instance, confessions of people. And nobody is telling them, well, to attract a confession, you have to beat them up or you have to rape them. They do that by themselves, but that sort of knowledge is generally spread in police and security organizations all over the world, or lower level military people active. I mean, don't be surprised by the cruelty of people when they get an opportunity to be cruel. And what you mean by the question, what's the point of it? I can only answer, there is no point, as far as I can see. We have to do with regimes and officials and local power holders who are connected or united among themselves after one general aim. We have to get on top of this target group, or we have to drive them away, or we have to deport and detain them. This is not discussed in any, let's say, democratic or rational sense. It's led by ideology and by common beliefs among perpetrators, I'm afraid. And there is no intrinsic point whatsoever.
Dr. Zwaan,
yes,
thank you very much indeed for all your answers, which I have no doubt have been of interest to all of us. We've got your paper, which contains a couple of other subjects I might have asked you about, the regimes in which, the driving forces for genocides as it has boiled down in recent years, and you explained that. Also, the period of time over which genocides may build up, and you've already touched on that. But is there anything else that you think that we've missed that you would like to round off with before we bid you further thanks and not farewell, because you can stay online, of course, but farewell for this part of the day?
No, I don't think so. It makes no sense to try to wrap it up by a set of conclusions. I think we had a very fruitful discussion. And I tried to be as concise and short as possible in my paper or the note I sent to you. And I think this should be it. So thank you in turn.
Well, that's a very, very helpful way to deal with it. Thank you again for responding so swiftly to our last minute request and for making yourself available here today. Thank you, Dr. Zwaan. And please stay on if you wish to, because we're about to have
I want to thank you all for the very interesting and also very difficult questions. And it was an honor and a pleasure to make a small contribution to your deliberations. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It's actually, I'm just going to take a break for 1 minute, and while the remaining contributors gather. Thanks very much.
Good. I see Dr. Zenz has joined us, so welcome to him. I think we're now full house again. Good morning, Dr. Zenz.
Afternoon in England.
So Jeffrey will extend further thanks, but thank you for joining us.
We're just sorting out power here, but I think we're going to be all right. I hope so. Good afternoon again. And we now have evidence from one principal witness and two others. Principal witness is Dr. Zenz, who's given evidence twice before, both the June and September hearings. And we will also hear from Professor Millward and Dr. Tobin. But it's first of all necessary to set the scene for this evidence. And I'm going to do it by checking whether Dr. Zenz, who's already been introduced twice before, so I'm not going to take time with that right now, whether Dr. Zenz's understanding of the position is as follows. In the September hearings, the tribunal was provided directly, but on terms of complete anonymity, with electronic copies of documents on a device. They were briefly looked at by those in the tribunal, making a guess, assessment as to what they might be. And in light of that assessment, Dr. Zenz, who's temporarily away from his camera, but I think he'll be back, Dr. Zenz was invited to examine the material for us. Efforts were made to get the material to the United States of America, but unfortunately that didn't work because of carriage problems. And he was invited to come to London, and Mr. Vetch and I were dealing with these matters directly for various reasons, including indeed the fact that counsel was highly tied up on something else at that time. So, Dr. Zenz, you came to London, is this correct? Nod if it is.
Yes, I received a very kind invitation.
And you came to London and you had some encounters with Mr. Vetch, which is unusual because we are the tribunal members and you're a witness, but it was unavoidable. You examined the material or gave it a first examination and had some discussions with us as to the way forward in light of what you thought you had. You were then provided with a copy of the files, electronically of course, and you went back to America and examined them in detail. The provision of the electronic files was on terms that they should never be shown themselves in public, because the mere pieces of paper that had been photographed could reveal where they came from and thus possibly expose people to risk. So it was agreed between Mr. Vetch, you and me that you would do certain exercises on the electronic files, but that it was important your work be peer-reviewed at great speed in order that you and your peer reviewers could present findings here today in advance of judgment to be delivered on the 9th of December. Am I right thus far?
Entirely.
The three parts of the verification or the peer review, I should say, of your work was, first of all, the question of authentication of the documents that were photographed. The second part, because the original documents can never be screened publicly, was that the transposition, or the whatever the correct term is, taking the characters off the page of the photocopied documents and putting those characters precisely onto other clean sheets of paper or clean electronic sheets of paper, that was done accurately. And then following on from that, there would be review by your peers of your findings about the documents that you had seen. Have I got that right?
Yes.
And the two peer reviewers, both of whom had been witnesses at the tribunal, Dr. David Tobin and Professor James Millward, one in England and one in America. Each of them was given access to electronic versions of the original files so that they could see the original files without ever allowing them to be seen by others other than maybe their immediate and necessary associates. And they're here to give evidence today, if necessary, to help us. So with that introduction, Dr. Zenz, you've provided two reports, one of 31 pages, I think, and one of 49. We're going to work on the basis of the 31-page report. It may be that the 41-page, which is just more detailed with a lot more material on it, will also be posted on the website, but the 31-page report will definitely be posted on the website as soon as your evidence is complete. I may have got that wrong, Mr. Vetch.
That's not. Dr. Zenz has advised us that he needs a little longer to ensure that his longer report, which is the one that will be posted, is put into correct form, and that the peer reviewers have finished finally their work. And so it is likely that those documents and the statements from the peer reviewers will be posted on Monday.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry I got that slightly wrong. So probably the best thing, Dr. Zenz, is for you to tell us to tell us what you found, or what it was that you were looking at, and then to tell us what your conclusions are as a result of what you were able to see.
Thank you indeed. Basically, the Uyghur Tribunal was given a set of files, some of which were duplicate. They were consolidated into 11 distinct files with about 300 distinct pages, 317 pages in total. After analysis, it is evident that these files are directly linked to the so-called Xinjiang papers. The Xinjiang papers are a cache of government documents from China, nearly all of them classified, explicitly classified, that were originally leaked to the New York Times and published by the Times on November 16th, 2019. As such, they're not to be mistaken with the so-called China cables, which confusingly were published 1 week later on November 24th, 2019, by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and myself. The New York Times at the time only published a small number of transcribed pages from the Xinjiang papers and quoted from several, but not all documents. Several documents are not even mentioned in the Times article. The Times also never released the originals into the public domain. These files contain several speeches by Xi Jinping and other central government leaders. They contain several directives and speeches by Chen Quanguo and the Xinjiang authorities, and they contain 3 central government issued documents on the topics of history, religion, and the southward development of the so-called Bingtuan or Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. One of the documents is classified as top secret, GME, which is China's highest state secret classification level for government documents, denoting material that, if leaked, will cause particularly serious damage to the security and interests of the country, which is 1 level higher than the China cables. Overall, and this is something that we did not glean from the first original New York Times report, this appears to be the first ever instance that material but the highest top secret classification containing statements by a Chinese head of state have leaked into the public domain. The original New York Times report noted how the words of Xi Jinping, quote, laid the groundwork for the crackdown, but only identified a small number of conceptual linkages between Xi's words and the subsequent policies in Xinjiang, in line with a still evolving understanding of the atrocities back in 2019. The present analysis, which was conducted on this leak, however, shows that the linkages between statements and mandates made by Xi Jinping and other central government figures and the policies that were subsequently implemented after 2016 and then 17 are far more detailed and extensive and significant than previously understood. I reviewed and authenticated the material. I carefully compared it to what the New York Times publicly divulged in their report, and I authenticated it based on a substantial number, many dozen of independent sources from Xinjiang and Chinese government documents, state media reports. For example, several of the speeches are quoted. There's lengthy literal quotation of state media reports at the time, for example, of several of the speeches that are contained in the leak. Based on all of this, it appears to myself and the peer reviewers both concurred with this, that the material appears to be, first of all, authentic, and second of all, an identical subset of the Xinjiang papers first published by the Times. However, it appears that the Uyghur Tribunal was not given all of the files that the Times received. I contacted the New York Times with several questions, including whether the files received by the Tribunal were the Xinjiang papers that they had previously reported on, and whether the Times had potentially passed them to the Tribunal, or if there was any knowledge of who may have passed them to the Tribunal. The Times responded with an official statement through their spokesperson confirming that, quote, the documents received by the Tribunal were previously reported on by the New York Times in 2019. The documents were not supplied to the Tribunal by the Times, end of quote. I would like now, please, the PowerPoint to start with the first slide. On the PowerPoint, we will see some of the original yes, these are the New York Times original report contained 13 fully transcribed pages from the original Chinese documents data received. Most of them pertained to a particular document from Topan Prefecture for returning Uyghur students from Eastern China with detained family members, and this document was not provided to the Tribunal. 4 of the fully transcribed pages published by the Times are contained in the set obtained by the Tribunal. And I'm publishing a detailed introduction to the leak and its authentication methods. This is going to be finalized. I apologize for the delays. This is just a huge amount of work, and we've worked against a very tight deadline. And so we are hoping to publish both this overview document and 3 of the 11 transcripts by Monday. And then subsequently, we hope to publish as many as possible by December 9th or as we are able to. So if we now move, please, to the next slide, we can see how on the right hand, you still have the original transcript from the New York Times, and on the left hand, you still have the original transcript from the New York Times, published in their report as a screenshot. And on the right-hand side, you now have the transcript that was created by myself and my research assistant, who transcribed this from the original paper documents. And you see that they're basically identical. I can, even the formatting, the layout, etc. So this is just one example. And let's go to the next page. We see the placements also, a lot of the details. The paper margins differ slightly. Our reproduction is not 100% in terms of the margins. And of course, we also had to work with very severe security precautions. only a very limited number of people were able to see the original paper documents on the original electronic media. Next slide, please. I took the trouble of looking at every single of the thumbnails published by the New York Times. They published 403 thumbnails, and I identified all of the documents leaked to the Uyghur Tribunal in the thumbnails. This was possible because you could see, even though you cannot read the text, you can see the broad textual outline with the indents and where there's a blank, where there's text, where there's bullet points, if there's a header, etc. I also identified duplicate pages, etc. I don't have the time, and I don't want to go into all the details here. The New York Times thumbnails contain several duplicate images, and I asked the Times for comment on that, but they chose not to comment on it. I assume it might be human error. But in any case, it was possible to identify all the pages given to the Uyghur Tribunal among the thumbnails published by the Times, except for two. There's a two-page fragmentary document of just 2 pages of speeches of Chen Quanguo from 2018, and those are not contained in the thumbnails published by the Times. Next slide, please. I'm just giving 2 examples where I magnified the Times thumbnails and then created a similar impression from the original documents that was given to the tribunal. I applied similar blurring and similar downsizing, and as you can tell, this is a page from the confession of one of the officials, Wang Yongzhi, that featured quite prominently in the Times report. You see the location of the thumbnail blown up, and you see the 4 thumbprints and the outlines of the text. You see the Times applied this very slightly different blurring algorithm that created a more square impression of the thumbnails. But otherwise, you can tell they're basically the exact same document. Next slide, please. Again, this is the second page of the final speech of Xi Jinping while inspecting Xinjiang from April 2014. And again, I blew up a thumbnail of the Times and increased the contrast to make the outline stand out more. And again, you can see the blue arrows indicate paragraph indents or indents in the text. You can see that, except for the fact that a slightly different blurring algorithm was employed by the New York Times. I used Photoshop for this. The documents are identical, and that's also how it was possible to identify and compare the pages leaked to the tribunal to the thumbnails provided by the Times.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Zenz, just to make you aware that the audience cannot see the screenshot, the screen. So just bear that in mind when you're describing things, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, can you see it, or?
We can see it, but the wider audience cannot see what's up here.
Oh, the wider audience cannot see it. Okay. I apologize for that. However, in my detailed report published, hopefully on Monday, all of this will be shown. These are basically screenshots from my report. I apologize, but basically this shows how I was able to identify the pages and compare the documents leaked by the tribunal to the ones published by the New York Times in 2019. It should also be mentioned that the New York Times did not mention several documents at all and categorized them also in a very confusing way, namely under surveillance. They have a large category where they say this pertains to surveillance, and this category actually includes 3 central government documents. But anyways, you can read that in the report. There's a lot of interest. Just a comparison to the New York Times publication is a very interesting exercise in itself. But now we need to move on to the next page, please. And I'll try to keep in mind that the wider audience cannot see these slides, which is unfortunate. But I guess that's part of the YouTube streaming. So next slide, please. So this is just what I'm doing now is I'm just showing 3 slides now that compare the layout of these types of documents. So the authentication firstly rested on a comparison of the material to the material published by the New York Times. And this, by the way, also included the Chinese version of the Times quoted literally from the documents. They did not translate, of course. And that was very helpful. There's, I think, about 27 passages that were quoted in a New York Times article that could be identified in 100% identical form in the documents. And this is an appendix to my report. The second authentication consisted in comparing the material to independently available material on the Chinese internet, government websites, state media reports. And the third authentication method consisted in looking at the types of documents and their formatting and how it conforms to types of documents that we know about, formatting requirements that have been published, and so on. This just compares. On the left hand, you see, well, those who can see it, the left hand is an example of a central government circular or bulletin issued by the central government, what those look like. And then on the right-hand side is the example of one of the document number 1 leaked to the Uyghur Tribunal of a speech by Xi Jinping in April 2014. Next slide. This is one of 3 central government documents which were not mentioned by the New York Times. Again, you see on the left hand an example from a Chinese government website or a Chinese website of one of those documents. And then on the right hand, document number 7 that was leaked to the Uyghur Tribunal about the southward development of the XPCC, the colonial settler entity. Bearing in mind that we at the Victims of Communism Foundation, we attempted to reproduce these documents from the originals as well as we could. We do not claim that these reproductions are 100% accurate. They are very close. They are decent, good enough to recognize and see the similarities, but we don't claim 100%, just as a caveat. And then the next slide, please. And this shows the third type of document found in the cache among the 11 documents. 3 of the documents are so-called cables or telegrams. And on the left side, you see, for comparison, the China cables, which was leaked and published 1 week after the Xinjiang papers in late November 2019. And on the right-hand side, you see one of the telegrams leaked to the tribunal, which was also published by the Times. This is a directive from June 2017, signed by Zhu Hailun on security measures to be taken and lessons to be learned from the lone wolf attacks in England. Next slide, please. So this just again shows authentication, just one sample. And we have fairly lengthy tables in the authentication. Showing how some, especially the speeches of Xi Jinping, are quoted extensively by state media reports from the time and are therefore fairly easy to authenticate. You also can tell what state media said and what they did not say, which is quite interesting. And then one more slide forward. Again, this was mentioned in the original New York Times report. This is the cover page. The top secret speeches by Xi from April 2014 were prefaced by a cover page that said they are to be studied. This is in October 2016. After Chen Quanguo came into power, he had these top secret speeches distributed, but with stringent security measures. Only certain officials could study them, and they had to be returned. You could not photocopy them, etc. Very stringent security measures, very interesting. And again, this is easily authenticated. On the left-hand side, you see reports, some even with pictures of officials studying them. This one is from a little later, from February 2017. We also have ones that are from immediately after this was published, from October 2016, how they were studied. So this really happened. This is not just a theory. One further, so oftentimes we could extensively authenticate the context of documents.
Dr. Zenz, forgive my interrupting you. Those of us who need to see this aspect of your work for the judgment, of course, have the written report, in fact,
Yes.
both of them, which may be posted on Monday.
Yes.
The wider audience can't see it, but I should inform you that the Embassy of the People's Republic of China were notified in writing earlier of this hearing. They, of course, will be in the same position as the wider public, so they won't be able to see this material today, but they should be able to see it, we hope, on Monday. And it may be that you'll think fairly soon it's time to move to the substance of what you saw, because the material that we can see on the screen and others can't is available for us in any event in written form.
Good timing, because I was just about to do that. This is the last slide containing the screenshots. And I was unfortunately not aware that the wider audience would not be able to see this, so apologies again. That's, of course, a bit unfortunate.
No need to. It's just the way it worked out.
Good. So, moving on to the contents and the summary and implications of the findings, which should, I imagine, take another 25-ish minutes or so. We should be done by 8:55 or 9, my time here. The material provides substantial evidence linking many aspects of Beijing's crackdown in Xinjiang to explicit statements or even demands made by central government figures in 2014, which is, I think, a central point, including the mass internment and re-education camps, labor transfers, optimizing the population, criminalizing customary religious practices, forcing hundreds of thousands of Han officials to become family with ethnic populations, and implementing Chinese language-focused education in centralized boarding schools, and finally, predictive policing and extensive surveillance. All of these aspects are mentioned and mandated. First, internment. The documents state that Xi Jinping himself in 2014 authorized the Xinjiang government to draft a local regulation to address the issue of religious extremism. The resulting de-extremification regulation came into effect in April 2017, and as I have argued before, and in fact at the last hearing of the Uyghur Tribunal, this regulation is extensively linked and intimately linked with the re-education campaign. Its October 2018 revision constituted the first official acknowledgement that the so-called vocational skills education and training centers perform quote-unquote re-education. In its original report, the New York Times quite famously cited Chen Quanguo's mandate to round up everyone who should be rounded up. However, it did not mention that Xi Jinping himself issued an arguably quite similar demand in 2014 when he mandated that, quote, those who should be seized, and those who should be sentenced should be sentenced. And on this current slide, those of you who can see it see an overview of the different statements that were made throughout these documents of terms like this. Document number 3 says, detain all who should be detained. Document number 8 says, do the roundup all who should be rounded up work well, etc. Other documents of the confessions of officials repeat the statement, round up all who should be rounded up on several occasions. Xi Jinping's statement that religious extremism is like a, quote, powerful psychedelic drug, and that acts of terror will, quote, multiply like cancer cells, end of quote, if extremist thought is not eradicated, are quoted verbatim and attributed to Xi in a widely cited March 2017 government document from Kashgar in southern Xinjiang that likens re-education to free medical treatment for, quote, sick thinking. And that's shown on the next slide. This screenshot from this document who says this, like, re-education is like a free hospital treatment to help people, to heal people. And at the very time when Xi demanded that people's immunity against extremist ideology must be increased, Uyghur regions were actively carrying out early forms of re-education and reported that these re-education efforts were, quote, increasing the immunity of susceptible groups of people, end of quote. In two separate speeches, Xi called religious extremism, quote, a poison, end of quote. He argued that Xinjiang was stricken with a heart sickness that could only be cured with a heart medicine in order to, quote, support the correct and remove the evil. A 2017 work report on re-education in the Uyghur region quoted the latter expression verbatim when stating that re-education must, quote, support the correct and remove the evil. Importantly, this Kashgar document from March 2017, that's so very blunt about re-education, was widely noted in 2018, and it's cited in my report from back then. It noted that people had now been sent for re-education despite the fact that they had not committed any acts of violence, but simply because they had been, quote, infected. And this is, if you move to the next page. It says, quote, although some people, after being affected by the infiltration of religious extremism and violent terrorist thoughts, have yet to carry out violent terrorist activities themselves, they have already been infected with the virus of religious extremism and violent terrorist thoughts and could act at any moment, endangering themselves and those around them. They must be sent to transformation through education classes to receive hospitalized treatment, to eliminate the harm of the virus and restore their mental health. End of quote. This shows how Xi Jinping's statements in 2014 undergirded a development that culminated in a preventative eradication of an alleged pathogen in re-education centers, even where illegal acts or acts of violence had not yet been committed. A later and widely cited academic paper on transformation through education from the Xinjiang Party School in 2017 likewise linked re-education with the removal of poisonous thinking. Xi Jinping also, in his 2014 speech, commented directly on re-education in the context of transforming criminals. He said, quote, it is important to do a good job with reform through education and transformation through education of offenders so as to prevent a practice of arrest and then release in large numbers, as well as cross-infection. The problem of cross-infection should be effectively addressed so that criminals cannot establish ties and engage in communication with each other while in educational transformation facilities, lest they become poisoned more deeply and do greater harm when they're released. Even after release, these people are to be subjected to continued transformation through education. So she is basically saying here that Xinjiang must achieve a thorough re-education to prevent arresting people, re-educating them, and releasing them, so that those who have once been re-educated will not in the future be found to be in need of further re-education and undergo multiple cycles of arrest, re-education, and release. With this mandate, he set the stage for the more intensified forms of re-education in dedicated transformations re-education facilities. He also mandated the ongoing re-education of those who have been released. That's a practice that was then since implemented. The leaked government document titled the Karakash List shows that when Xinjiang embarked on its campaign of mass internment in 2017, many were detained into re-education facilities simply because they had previously been interned or imprisoned. This, in brief, are the linkages between statements by Xi Jinping and central government figures and the subsequent campaign of re-education. Secondly, the documents show that plans to optimize the ethnic population composition, which are connected to the campaign of suppressing births, can be linked to statements and demands made by the central government. In a top secret speech, Xi argued that population, quote, population proportion and population security are important foundations for long-term peace and stability, end of quote. This statement has later been quoted verbatim on several occasions, including by Liu Ilei, a senior Xinjiang official, in July 2020, who then famously argued that southern Xinjiang's Han population share was too low, only 15%. Please show the next slide for that. There you see the quote. And the emphasis in italics is the exact wording from Xi Jinping, with which he prefaces then his really drastic statement about that there's not enough Han in southern Xinjiang. Other classified documents lament, quote, severe imbalances in the distribution of the ethnic population, end of quote, and, quote, a severely mono-ethnic, end of quote, population structure in southern Xinjiang, meaning an overconcentration of Uyghurs. One of the classified central government documents mandates that by 2022, 300,000 settlers, mostly Han from eastern China, are to be moved to regions in southern Xinjiang administered by the Xinjiang Construction and Production Corps, the XPCC or Bingtuan, with the explicitly stated aim of increasing Han population shares in the region. And the latter is something that we have not known yet, that we did not know before from publicly available documents. Xi himself ordered the abolishment of preferential birth control policies for ethnic groups in southern Xinjiang. His demand that birth control policies were to be made, quote, equal for all ethnic groups, end of quote, is a euphemism that since 2017 undergirded policies that dramatically reduced birth rates. To name just one pertinent example, Xinjiang's Health Commission established a set of performance targets in 2019 that employed the exact same expression as the one used by Xi Jinping. Quote, implement a birth control policy that is equal for all ethnic groups, end of quote. That exact statement is found as in a text that contains an overall goal behind a new mandate to reduce birth rates in southern Xinjiang by at least 4 per mil, to provide free birth control surgeries that include female sterilization, and to achieve an adoption rate of long-term effective birth prevention measures of at least 90% in rural regions. These are measures that include IUDs and sterilizations. A central government directive from December 2017, which is document number 7 in the leaked file cache, makes a very similar demand, mandating to, quote, enact birth control policies that are equal for each ethnic group, end of quote. But then it bluntly adds that this measure is specifically designed to do, quote, to promote equal population growth for each ethnic group, or you could also translate balanced population growth for each ethnic group. Xi Jinping, in his speech, further mandated that the XPCC is to, quote, bring into play its role in optimizing population resources and become a staging area for optimizing the population, end of quote, in southern Xinjiang. All of these mandates are exactly in line with recommendations made by numerous Xinjiang academics and experts on population growth and population optimization who have unilaterally called for such measures. And the next slide provides a comparison table. So basically what we have here is we have statements by Xi Jinping himself and related central government documents. I assume the next slide is going to come up soon here. That underlie statements that in my publication from this year, which I presented at the first tribunal hearing, I presented statements and demands by scholar cadres, scholars who often also hold government positions or are funded by government or influential for government. Could we have the next? Let's see. Sorry, you've gone one too far. Could you go one back to the table? Yes, thank you. And in my research paper that I presented at the first tribunal hearing, and I apologize, this is in Chinese, but it gives you the idea, the comparison. Of course, we had said, well, I sort of had to strain a little bit. I strained to make an argument that this is influential, that you can see this is being implemented. These are demands made by academics, and this is not just academic discourse, but there is some influence. We see this reflected in some government policy. We see this reflected in decreased birth rates. We see some evidence that this is happening and that this is to be taken seriously. But of course, there was speculative elements in this. With the new evidence from the leaked documents, we can now say with much more strongly that these developments and these discourses about population optimization can be directly traced to classified statements made by Xi Jinping and central government figures and then further expounded in a central government document and directive that stated as much about population development in southern Xinjiang. This is, I don't know if I can communicate the extreme significance of this new evidence and what it does with our existing understanding, especially on population optimization. Of course, you have to read through a bit of the coded language. It doesn't directly say, oh, we need to sterilize Uyghur women. It doesn't directly say we need to drastically slash birth rates. There's, of course, some these terms, you know, to equalize population growth, balance population growth, equal for birth control policy for ethnic groups, population security, etc. You do have to look at this still with an expert analysis and a careful discursive comparison. But within that, with that extra effort and within all of that context, from an expert perspective, the new evidence is of extreme significance in underscoring trends and developments that we had good evidence on, that we were making pretty strong allegations about, but still had quite a bit of speculative element in it. So just to contextualize that.
Can I just interrupt you there for a minute? It's of course easier for us because we've had your draft report in advance, and so we've been able to see the things that the wider audience can't see. And it may be that one or two things need clarifying. You've referred to the top level of secrecy document with the speech of Xi Jinping. Did the New York Times have that document themselves, as you understand it, and from what you've been able to see of the thumbnails?
Yes, the New York Times had both of the documents with speeches by Xi Jinping are shown in full in the thumbnails, and the Uyghur Tribunal has every single page of them. And they have the same missing page too.
Yeah, and did the New York Times quote from, use, or display any part of those speeches?
No, they were very careful. They did not show a transcript. I think probably not to offend China. And I know the New York Times was and continues to be concerned about the security of their reporters.
Yes, well,
back then in Beijing.
Don't trouble yourself too much with working out what may be the reasoning. I
Yes.
just want to know, for the purposes of the wider audience, where you've been talking about the contents of the two speeches of Xi Jinping,
Yes.
have those contents as his speeches ever been published before by the New York or anyone else?
No, never in full. The New York Times quoted very selectively from them and didn't show a single full transcript page, not even one. So very selectively. And several, especially the statements regarding to population and birth control and population security and population structure, those were not mentioned by the Times. And of course, back in 2019, that was not really a research topic yet.
Thank you. Sorry, I interrupted your flow. Do carry on.
Okay. So the new evidence is of high significance in that it permits a much stronger case to be made for the argument that the specific demands made by high-ranking Xinjiang academics and politicians like Liu Ilei to optimize Xinjiang's ethnic population structure reflect the previously articulated will of the central government. And if Xinjiang's, quote, unbalanced and, quote, mono-ethnic population structure is of concern for China's national security, then related countermeasures, including a policy of equalizing ethnic population, which includes being achieved through measures to curb Uyghur birth rates, are very likely or are almost certain to be pursued into the long term until the perceived problem is resolved. And my argument, of course, is that the problem is resolved when the related targets have been achieved. Next topic, and I'll be briefer on that one. The material shows considerable evidence about forced labor transfers that later became more coercive. It shows that the transfer of nearly 3 million rural surplus laborers through a vigorous development of labor-intensive industries was designed to prevent Uyghurs from, quote, having nothing to do and therefore being, quote, easily exploited by evildoers. These are quotes from Chinese Premier Li Keqiang in a classified speech from May 2014. Xi Jinping, similarly, in the same speech, the same document, May 2014, suggested that unemployed persons are liable, quote, to provoke trouble, end of quote, and that employment in companies promotes ethnic mixing and helps workers to, quote, resist religious extremism. And there's several more on that. Xi himself calls one other leading central government figures announced a plan to drive at least 1 million people into employment through textile and garment industries, a plan that was formalized then in 2018. We had no idea that this was mandated by the central government in 2014. It's amazing, really amazing. And then Xi Jinping himself called for systematic expansion of ethnic persons being moved to or going to Eastern China for education, employment, and residence. In sum, the mandates contained in the Xinjiang papers quite directly undergird the implementation of significantly more coercive labor transfer mechanisms between 2015 and 2017. A central government figure who made very interesting remarks here is Yu Zhengsheng. In 2014, he was the head of the Central Committee Xinjiang Work Group and chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. The latter post made him China's fourth highest ranking official at the time. Next slide, please. In his speech in May 2014, he argues that given that southern Xinjiang has a poor natural conditions, a weak economic foundation, poor employment conditions, a monolithic population structure, there are many people who face difficulties, a distorted religious atmosphere, a complicated surrounding environment, and a situation involving severe struggles. How can we solve the problems of southern Xinjiang, maintain social stability, and realize long-term peace and stability without implementing special policies? He makes the statements of great interest because it links different aspects together as a related problems. Poor employment, a monolithic, meaning mono-ethnic population structure, distorted religious atmosphere. Similar linkages are found in important discourses and key reports among cadres and scholars in Xinjiang regarding the need to optimize southern Xinjiang's population. And also, we know about the role that labor transfers play in Beijing's plans to alter Xinjiang's population composition. This speaks directly to that topic. Fourthly, the classified material speaks to numerous other policies designed to assimilate and control the ethnic groups, including Chinese language-focused education in centralized boarding schools, more intensive forms of predictive policing through the analysis of big data, or sending Han officials to live with Uyghur families. These can all be linked to direct statements made by Xi Jinping. For example, Xi demanded that rural children should be put into boarding schools so that they would, quote, study in school, live in school, grow up in school, end of quote. His observation that, quote, some religious people interfere with matters of secular life, including marriage, funerals, etc., end of quote, was soon after formalized as the mandate that, quote, religion is strictly forbidden to interfere with secular lifestyles, end of quote. And by 2017, we see how this policy undergirded the internment of persons in re-education camps who had simply offered customary prayers at funerals or participated in customary religious wedding ceremonies. Xi's remarks and requirements provided the basis for criminalizing most of the customary religious practices that are part of ethnic populations' daily lives. And this link has not really been made to that extent in an original New York Times report. The files also show the motivation behind these unprecedented measures. In a top-secret speech, Xi Jinping argued that the Belt and Road Initiative required a stable domestic security requirement. He asserted that the entire country's national security and the achievement of China's major goals in the 21st century are in jeopardy. The so-called two centennial goals are in jeopardy if the situation in southern Xinjiang cannot be brought under control. He demanded specifically that the region engaged in an all-out battle to, quote, prevent Xinjiang's violent terrorist activities from spreading to the rest of China. And he noted that since that has already happened to an extent, quote, therefore we propose that Xinjiang is currently in a painful period of interventionary treatment, end of quote. And so on. I'm skipping over some details. It of course also shows that officials in Xinjiang who did not fully obey orders and failed to, for example, detain all those who, quote, should be detained, meaning large numbers of the local population in re-education facilities, were severely punished. This was reported by New York Times. He declared that...
Can I just interrupt
yes?
for a minute? You referred to the two centennial events. Can you, in case you had explained them and I'd missed them, I'm sorry, but in case you haven't explained that, can you just fill that in, that little detail, please?
Yes, the two centennial goals are firstly to build a moderately prosperous society by 2021, which is the centenary of the CCP, of the founding of the CCP. And second, to build a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, and advanced by 2049, which is the centenary of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you.
Which is, yeah. Together, they constitute basically Beijing's most important political goals in the coming decades. Xi Jinping said, we must have strong faith in our victory, make a determined effort, and even have to pay a special price sometimes, which I think is quite an apt statement to make in 2014, given what happened later. He then said, in the face of rampant violent activities, we must focus our current fight on a severe crackdown on violent terrorist activity. We must not hesitate or waver in the use of the weapons of the People's Democratic Dictatorship and focus our energy on executing a crushing blow that buys us time and initiative for solving the deep-seated issues regarding Xinjiang's long-term peace and stability. Especially the latter statement, the crushing blow that buys us time and initiative, is quite an apt description of Beijing's strategy since the speech and especially since 2014. Also, other statements could be quoted of how important Xi's statements from 2010 were, and it's really no wonder that they were studied in detail by Xinjiang officials. Yu Zhengsheng made further statements about the significance of the decisions made by the Xinjiang work group and Xi Jinping 2014. Next slide, please. He said in May 2014, we must thoroughly comprehend that doing a proper job, this was Xi's quote. One further slide, yes. We must thoroughly comprehend that doing a proper job in Xinjiang is not only a matter for the region, but also a major issue for the whole party and the entire country. If the Xinjiang situation is not handled properly, it will affect the overall situation of reform, development, and stability of the country and the realization of the two centennial goals, which I refer to. In conclusion, the new evidence provides crucial information regarding the intent behind the recent policies and atrocities in Xinjiang. They show that they are not just local initiatives or temporary measures, but pertain to the long-term strategy of the central government in Beijing about the region. The new evidence, firstly, confirms our existing knowledge of the various aspects of the atrocities in the region that we had from witness accounts and publicly available records, but now confirmed through confidential internal government documents. Second, confirms that these acts are not merely local or regional in nature, but in line with direct demands made by central government figures, including Xi Jinping himself. Third, confirms that these acts are broadly pursued with the explicit intent to safeguard key national policies, such as the Belt and Road, the two centennial goals, to safeguard China's national security as perceived by the CCP, which is to safeguard the long-term rule and survival of the CCP. And finally, it confirms the author's prior view that Beijing is not seeking to fully physically eliminate the Uyghurs as entire groups, but is seeking to fully assimilate them, to change their social structure, to alter their ethnic population structure and distribution so as to more easily control and integrate them. Smaller populations are easier to manage, which has, among other things, has led to many drastic measures, including higher mortality, and notably a drastic campaign of preventing births that is I'm now more certain than ever likely to continue until the related population optimization targets have been met. The author I had previously outlined a goal that by 2040 this could lead to a loss of between 2.6 and 4.5 million lives through measures designed to prevent births. The significance of this new evidence for an atrocity determination is as follows. If a systematic attack against a civilian population is carried out, or atrocities, as part of a long-term strategy pursued by the central government, and if the strategy is said to be of great importance to ensure China's national security, then it is far more likely that related policies and resulting human rights violations or loss of life are systematically and rigorously pursued into the long term until the stated or implied goals are reached. I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zenz. I think that we'll proceed in the following way. I'll ask Dr. Tobin and then Professor Millwall to make their observations. I think they'll be comparatively short. And then I'll see if there are questions of all three of you by my colleagues or indeed by me. So, Dr. Tobin.
Thank you. So the Xinjiang papers reveal less new information on policy and more evidence of the chain of command behind the policy, as we just heard from Dr. Zenz. They really show that targeted crackdowns on Uyghurs intensified and accelerated in response to commands from the Central Party Committee and Xi Jinping himself. Now, this fits everything we know about the centralized political system of the PRC and how almost all aspects of everyday Uyghur life are treated as national security matters. The content also matches what we have observed over the last few years in mosque demolitions, mass internment, coercive birth controls and forced labour. However, this is the most significant and most detailed evidence thus far that these specific practices have been designed, disseminated and implementation monitored and policed by the top levels of the party state. Very important to point out the chronology of the documents that Adrian has just discussed. The 2014 speeches from Xi himself are really giving orders to implement new policy. The documents that I looked at in more detail from 2017 and 18, these really focus on implementing pre-existing policy. These are warnings for local officials, the mid-ranking and low-ranking leaders that Dr. Zwaan referred to, warning them they'll be punished for loose implementation, essentially telling us she thought the policy wasn't being implemented enough and we needed tightening and strengthening. So as a political scientist, this is how the political system operates. It's very familiar. You have centralized commands, then you have very variable implementation, and then the centre responds, reining in the regions depending on the gravity of the issue. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about document number 10, Strengthening and Progressing Islam Work Under New Conditions. Now, I've translated and translated this all myself. If this is not required, you can stop me. It's important, the title really indicates strengthening and progressing. The policy has not changed, but it should be strengthened. This is from April 2018. And it's highlighting it's not being fully implemented or achieving its goals, therefore it must progress. This is standard language in Chinese politics. You say it must progress more, it must be advanced more. This means it's not being implemented fully. It's a national level policy document. It doesn't mention Xinjiang until the signature at the very end. It's called an EGN, which can be translated as opinion or suggestions. Very important for Anglophone audiences to know this is a suggestion from the centre, and it means implement this policy, read the document and learn about the policy, and punishment and reward will follow. It's disseminated to all provinces, all tiers of government, all the way down to the county level. It's been widely studied by officials since it was distributed, with all cadres expected to follow its spirit, and all regions and related departments expected to implement its concrete measures. Found references to the document being studied by cadres and study sessions in Xinjiang in Ningxia, and of course in Xinjiang. So it's a clear and binding report on problems, quote, of basic implementation of Sinicization policies and the need to strengthen supervision of its implementation. Its key function really is reining in local cadres and institutions to follow central policy on Sinicization and, quote, maintain ideological security. For example, subsection 2, quote, there exist problems in basic Islam work of not being able, willing, or daring to monitor. The party's leadership of Islam work is being urgently strengthened. Document repeatedly reminds cadres and local leaders to implement, coordinate, and manage according to policy and law, with the centre in command in the context of ineffective, uncoordinated, and non-standardised management. See subsections 6, 7, 10, and 22 to 25. These also list things called democratic organisations, which will be unfamiliar to those who do not study Chinese politics. This largely refers to Shachu and Danwei, your work unit and your residential compound. And asking those organisations also to report on local cadres, to monitor whether policy is being implemented in your neighbourhood. Also explains repeatedly the need for greater and deeper education of the policy in areas of ethnicity, religion, and rule by law, subsection 6, 7, 12, 14, and 23. This means this is a statement that people do not understand policy or the thinking behind the policy. And that's important, the thinking behind it. These types of documents really, they always start by telling a story and then explain what must be done in response to the story. The story at the start of this document is that China is experiencing a rising tide of religious fever and waves of, quote, de-Sinicization. And these include Saudiization and Arabization. And within this context, there has been loose policy implementation. Islam in China is described as harmonious, but global Islam, quote, is referred to as a problem of infiltration. The word infiltration is used repeatedly to describe the influence of Islam from other countries. So therefore, Sinicization is really framed here as the need for political stability and national security. Give you some examples of the key practices it's outlined before I finish. Subsection 7, the principle is no new construction or establishment of activity venues, religious activity venues being community centres, but also mosques. New construction of venues must be steered to city and village regulations and regulations on land use, maintaining the principle of demolish many, build few, and merge mosque construction. The mergers of mosque construction has been covered in the media. Also, we've found many mosques are closed down for unrelated issues, land use, environmental regulations. This is an example of cadres being told to find reasons to close down mosques that are unrelated to religious policy. Also, do not set up religious venues and temporary places of worship for single ethnic or religious groups. Article 10, we must strengthen coordination and prevent public security incidents. Large-scale activities based on historical revisionism or superfluous ahistorical traditions are not permitted. Subsection 15, construction and renovation activities must give prominence to Chinese style. This is what we've observed in mosque renovations. Article 17, prevent expansion of the halal concept, referred to as foodstuffs security. And lastly, Article 20, subsection 20 rather, religious departments must strengthen the management and supervision of scripture colleges' teaching curriculum, teacher certification, student and staff recruitment scope, teaching outlines, use of teaching materials, funding sources, and other areas. This is far more detailed than I would expect to see from the Central Party. Most of my work would be focused on that larger narrative, the story of global Islam, and harmonious Islam within China is very, very familiar. Normal religion and abnormal religion, those phrases extremely familiar. But what we don't normally see in Central Party documents is such detail about micromanagement, about everyday activities, teaching, building mosques, going to mosques. So to conclude, We've heard from Dr. Zenz the evidence on how policies of mass internment, intergenerational separation, coercive birth controls and forced labour are being constructed and directed by the centre. Now we can say Sinicization, which includes mosque demolitions and ideological education, is official policy. It's not errant local cadres implementing things of their own volition. We now have clear evidence of its construction, implementation and supervision by the top levels of the party state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tobin. Professor Millward.
Yes, so while I agree with everything that Dr. Zenz and Dr. Tobin has said, my own approach to this particular task in front of us was I didn't work and analyze the documents directly myself, as Dr. Tobin and of course Dr. Zenz have done. My role was as a peer reviewer, and also I suppose someone who sort of has confirmed the process of confirming the authenticity of the document. So I sort of looked over that process. So I was provided by the Uyghur Tribunal with a set of files consisting of photographs of original documents. Adrian Zenz provided me with transcripts of these documents that he and his assistant had prepared, as well as a general introduction to the whole set, and specific introductions to documents 1, 2, and 4, and his longer document analysis of the contents for the Uyghur Tribunal, some of the contents of which he summarized this morning. Based on Dr. Zenz's evidence and arguments in his general introduction to the Xinjiang papers, I'm convinced that the files provided to me, the original documents provided to me as electronic scans, that they are in fact original Chinese government documents that they purport to be, and that they are substantially the same as the catch of documents earlier obtained but not fully published or made available by the New York Times, and with the differences being those differences that Professor Zenz, Dr. Zenz mentioned in his presentation this morning. My own review work involved a few different tasks. I reviewed Dr. Zenz's written materials as I would peer review manuscripts of academic articles. A second type of task involved checking English translations of the Chinese passages that Dr. Zenz quotes in his reports. And this was made easier by him providing original Chinese for those translations in all of his footnotes. But I then also checked the Chinese in the footnotes against the Chinese in the original documents and also in the transcriptions. And so I went through to make sure simply that where he was quoting and arguing from the documents, that those key passages were in fact accurately transcribed and conveyed from the original documents as they were. Finally, regarding the transcriptions of the documents in general, I did not go through them line by line, although I understand that that comparison has been done, that full proofreading has been done of the entire corpus of the transcriptions against the original documents. But I did spot check each transcription. So to do this, I chose a few passages at random from each document and compared them with the corresponding passage as it appears in the transcriptions prepared by Zenz and his assistant. So to conclude very quickly then, as a result of this, I'm highly confident that these are Chinese government documents, that they are substantially the same as the catch given to the New York Times. I'm confident that that transcriptions were carefully made. I'm confident that Dr. Zenz's discussions in his introductions to individual documents and the general introduction and analysis papers, that these are empirically and logically honest and compelling. The bottom line on these documents, as I see it from this process, is that they show how the policies that we've been examining and talking about for years now, sinicization, birth suppression, transfer of workers, putting small children in boarding schools, changing population distribution by moving Uyghurs out and moving Han into southern Xinjiang, increasing restrictions on Islam, and of course the mass internments in the camps. I'm confident that all these policies originate in concerns and mandates issued from top leadership in Beijing, including General Secretary Xi Jinping, from as early as 2014, as articulated in his speeches of that year. And that concludes my short statement.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, all. Before I see if my colleagues have questions and trying to think ahead, there's one technical matter that I ought to make clear for the benefit of the People's Republic of China. When your report is online, which we hope will be on Monday, of course, the original speech of Xi Jinping will not be photocopied because it can't be. But will there be a part of it or all of it in transcription in the original Chinese characters? Because if there is, then that will give them an opportunity to say, yes, it is a genuine document, or if they wish to challenge it. And obviously, we want them to have the earliest opportunity to accept that it is an accurate document, or if they want to challenge it, to say why. So will they have that opportunity on Monday, or will it be only part of the document on Monday? You're muted, I think.
Apologies. So the current status is that by Monday, we will be able to publish documents 1, 2, and 4, which includes the entire body of speeches by Xi Jinping. So everything that we have that was said by Xi Jinping. And in addition, document number 4, which is one of the summaries of a speech by Chen Quanguo. And then we will, as we're able to, so this includes much of the core evidence and everything said by Xi Jinping. Much of what we said relates to the center, and the speech by Premier Li Keqiang in Yuzhengsheng is included in document number 2. So much of what has been presented today would be available in full transcript. And then the documents, for example, referred to by Dr. Tobin on history and religion, document on population and the XPCC, and some of the speeches by Chen Quanguo, which, however, have been discussed more extensively in the original New York Times report, would then be published subsequently.
Thank you very much. I'll see now if my colleagues have any questions. Professor Korntal.
Thank you for your contributions and all your hard work. I have a short question and a longer question. The short question is both of which are for Dr. Zenz. So when you use the word monolithic and you describe it as monoethnic, could it be both? For instance, monolithic, the meaning could also mean something that's stubborn, large, slow to change, and indivisible, and needs to be crushed. So that's my first short question. The second question is with regard to the boarding school. You talked about learning in school, living in school, and growing up in school. With the third aspect, growing up in school, the boarding schools, can we take that to mean that the children were not permitted to go home if they had one? And following that, is there any evidence to suggest that there's some kind of connection with the parents in these centres called re-education centres and the children in the boarding schools? So we know that there's a rise of boarding schools. We know that there's an expansion of these so-called re-education centres. Is there anything beyond that to connect the children in the boarding school with the parents in the centres? Thank you.
Thank you. So to respond to question number 1, we have in the Chinese the term danyi, which means singular or mono, and then there would be a dash, and then you would have to, it's mono whatever came before that. And in several instances, we have the words for Renko Jiego, population structure. So we have a singular or monolithic or monocomposited population structure, meaning the population structure is homogeneous, highly homogeneous. Sometimes, in some instances, this refers to just population structure. So that could then mean several things. It could mean, for example, there's a too high homogeneity of people who all do the same work, or who are, or they're all too elderly if it was demographic or whatever. But in many cases, it's either implied, or in some cases, we directly have the word ethnic in there as well. And then it's directly monoethnic is the meaning. It can refer to several things. Mono-economic, for example, or monolithic in regards to employment structure, meaning there's too many rural surplus laborers who need to be transferred, too many in agriculture. Or there's too many poor people, too many uneducated people. And of course, we see also, that's why I brought in the statement by Xinjiang, the overlap, where it sees there's a problem. It's also mono-religious, right? So religion is also in that. It's too mono-religious, mono-economic, and mono-ethnic. And there's a national security overlap between all of those. So it's simply mono-dan-e. So that is the meaning, which means singular or homogeneous, or too much of the same. Second question regarding to boarding schools. This is a point that really, I think, warrants some significant further research. At the same time, we can say, when Xi Jinping talks about this, to study, live, and grow up. This is in a context that there's a clear understanding that boarding schools provide a better context for children to live and grow up in than the homes of poor, uneducated, uncivilized, backward ethnic minorities. All of these terms used, of course, in quotation marks, right? From the perspective of the party. A significant inference can be made that this means that they spend significantly more time in school than at home. So, for example, in boarding schools, it's quite common that maybe once a week, more commonly, once every 2 weeks, students can go home for 1 day or maybe 2 days. So that would be compatible with that. We cannot directly infer from this that they cannot leave boarding school, that they're confined in it. We do, however, know from other evidence published that this is, of course, compatible with the development that many students had one or both parents in re-education facilities, and then the school becomes the dedicated caretaker. And this, of course, Xi Jinping's statement is very broad, it's very general. It can refer to any of these scenarios. But at a minimum, it refers to a scenario where the children spend significantly more time living and growing up in a state-controlled school environment than they do at home.
Thank you, Professor Kumar.
Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting series of talks. Can I just talk about the sort of huge surfeit of medical analogues and metaphors and things like linking re-education to free medical treatment for thinking rather. Were these for the cadres who we've now heard had punishment and also success was celebrated, or was it for the general population? So that was my first question. The second question really was really in terms of what Dr. Zwaan was talking about earlier on, which is genocide and at which level the orders were sent. Did you get any feeling in the papers as to what happened at the bottom level, where clearly the message had been passed on to the bottom level to actually, so this would be the soldiers or whoever was looking after the people in their internment camps, who were actually metering out the perhaps the torture and the rape and so on. Is there any evidence that that came from the top? Thank you very much.
I respond first, and I'm sure the two peer reviewers can add to it if they would like to, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
So the first question, it is clear that the statements about the need for greater immunity against wrong thinking, basically, the medical analogies, they refer to society, ethnic society at large. One statement by Xi Jinping refers specifically to both cadres and the masses meaning the population. So there are a lot of statements in the documents that condemn the duplicity or two-facedness of cadres, or that cadres are not doing enough, or that they are, there's a lot of criticism of cadres, but it's by no means limited. In fact, much of the specific medical or pathognological terminology found refers generally to the population at large. Of course, to those who could be infected, quote unquote, by religious extremism. So that's really why I said it foreshadows the subsequent preventative re-education of persons who are considered susceptible or infected, but have not actually done anything illegal. To answer the second question, the documents are unusually frank because they're internal. They're unusually direct and tough on things that have not been done well. There's not been sufficient policing, sufficient intensity of security and surveillance, etc. There's a lot of internal criticism of a candid nature that we find some in some documents, some of the time, in some way, but nothing like this. And of course, unprecedented also is the detail of the confessions of the two county and the criticism of the two county leaders, county party secretaries, who were convicted of not having executed orders. It is clear that there's considerable pressure on lower cadres who are expected to implement, firstly, the will of the central government, and secondly, the will of Chen Quanguo and of the Xinjiang government. And there are official documents that link the two. So the lower level cadres are really under huge pressure and threat of punishment to implement what has been handed down from the top. But it's remarkable how everything is linked back to the center in Beijing. I commented on that in my report and testimony on the second tribunal hearing and related research paper. I already commented on that extensively. But with the leaked documents, the evidence we have linking this back to the center in Beijing and Xi Jinping himself has gone through the roof. It's unprecedented now.
Dr. Tobin or Professor Millwood, anything before Mr. Vetch asks a question on that question from Professor Kumar?
I agree with Dr. Zenz's statement. Briefly, the medical analogies used repeatedly to refer to ideological influence, and the documents really go down, particularly the Islam work goes down to county level. This would count as low-level cadres.
Professor Millwood? Mr. Vetch?
Yes, Jeffrey, I have a question from Professor Manji, and it's directed at Dr. Tobin. Could he use his expertise to explain to us what is going on discursively with statements such as those who should be seized should be seized? Does this pertain to the implementation analysis he has provided? Question. As a language expert, what is his assessment of the reasoning of these seemingly circular statements? Question.
The language used, those who should be seized will be seized, is deliberately vague in some senses because this is covering so many issues, so many practices. So it is absolutely about implementation. But we do need to remember Chinese politics works that way, where a lot of, especially issues of censorship and propaganda work, where you don't know where the red line is, so you deliberately avoid it. You stay away from politics. This is not so much about censorship, but this is why some of the language that we'd read in these documents appears to us sort of broad and ideological, but it is designed to do that cadres feel the pressure, and it's better to stay out of trouble, take the path of least resistance, do the easy task. So it's all about implementation. It's telling cadres to round people up. Who is it that should be seized? I mean, when I see this, I am reminded of my work in 2009 that I presented briefly at the first sessions, where it was being stated in education textbooks simply that those who disagree, those who say Uyghurs are a Turkic group or an Islamic group are essentially terrorists. Only the three evils would say this. This broad, those who should be seized, this to me, and what I think Chinese people would hear is Uyghurs who identify themselves as Turkic and Islamic.
Yes, Professor Mo.
Dr. Zenz presented a very interesting table of versions of that phrase: those who should be seized, all who should be seized should be seized, all who should be detained should be detained, and so on. And since there was a linguistic element to that question, I'd just like to sort of add that the thrust of all of these phrases is maximalist. It's not don't seize people who should not be seized. It's, in fact, and I think the phrase evolves over time from those who ought to be, seize those who ought to be seized. It evolves to, of those who ought to be seized, seize all of them, right? It adds a word, completely, jin, in the middle of that phrase in later iterations, and those are the ones quoted. So lest there be any ambiguity, this is not a call for deliberative, careful assessment of individuals and whether they present a problem or not. It is a very strong message to round up lots of people. And that is how these phrases come across.
Thank you. I thought I'd seen another hand. Yes, Mr. Clark.
Thank you. Just two sort of questions or observations which may disclose ignorance or naivety, but just one thing that struck me was that of document number 1, I think, which is where the speeches are, which have the highest secrecy attached to them, the top secrecy, and that. If one thinks that if this is what the president wishes to take place in Xinjiang, and it is going to clearly be seen relatively quickly afterwards, why was it that it was regarded as so secret that he had said this? And secondly, and perhaps slightly in contrast to that, one thing that struck me was that the speeches, or a number of them referred to in the paper, are from 2014, and yet it's 3 years later before the laws which he's called upon to be drafted and implemented actually arrive. I mean, I say that may be naive because it may be the monolithic nature of the Chinese state is such that 3 years may be very fast, but it struck me that if it was quite clear that this is what he wanted in 2014, it's taken 3 years for it to be actually hitting the legislative treatment 3 years later.
Who would like to go first?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, I'll respond, at least initially. So on the first subject, there were immediately after the speeches, there were things quoted by state media that were these are things that were supposed to be communicated to the public. There were things in his speeches that were only supposed to be communicated to cadres. And then there were things that were communicated mainly to the leadership in Xinjiang at the time. So what we see a very interesting development. For example, we see a number of things Xi Jinping said were later then quoted by the local leadership, by Xinjiang's party secretary at the time, Chen Quanguo, or by the governor, Shupat Zakir. They were never publicly attributed by Xi, some of these. So some were publicly attributed, others were then repeated by Xinjiang officials. Several statements were later on in similar form used by Chen Quanguo, and some were never used in any way, shape, or form. So the top secret designation protects these different layers of information and who information is designed for. Not Beijing did not want the entirety of this to be attributed to Xi Jinping. Absolutely not. Just to respond to your first question. The second question, as a matter of fact, there was an evolution. Maybe to you it looks like, oh, everything happened in 2017. But with re-education, for example, as I say in my report, there was actually ongoing re-education efforts at the time already. Dedicated facilities were being built in the autumn of 2014. The drafting of the legal legislation, the working group to start this drafting was formed in April 2015, about 1 year after, and it took them about 2 years. So there's an evolution of everything, but we can say that it looks like Beijing was not happy with the current leadership, Zhang Chunxian. With his implementation, they brought in Chen Xuanguo in August 2016. And it was under Chen Xuanguo that many of the things that happened before already, the initial re-education, the initial ramping up of boarding schooling, the initial sending down the cadres to the countryside, a lot of these developments, the initial labor transfers, they were ramped up dramatically. And I think this is the main, I already argued this in my February 2020 piece on the Karakash list. The main qualification or achievement of Chen Xuanguo, so to speak, was the incredible ramping up, the upscaling, the implementing of things that were already going on.
I'll just add to that. Dr. Zen's comments I agree with. I would locate my answer. I would explain this, both answers to both questions, through center-periphery relations that structure Chinese politics. Now, there's a real dimension to this that simply Xinjiang, Tibet, etc. are very far from Beijing. It's standard practice that it takes time for messages to get across. We used to assume leaders in Beijing don't know everything that happens, and it does take time for information to get back. Bear in mind, it's an authoritarian system where telling the leaders bad news is not something you want to do. And of course, as I've discussed in previous sessions, the institutional arrangements in Xinjiang some of them were organic. Over the years, they developed through practice. It wasn't some coordinated plan. What Xi Jinping has done is looked at the arrangements there, for example, the Bingtuan, and said, we need to rein this in. We need more centralization. And that's been his main platform. So that's located very well in this. And it's also about, as Adrian said, about not wanting to pin the blame on Xi. This isn't just about this issue. This is how Chinese politics works. The legitimacy of the center is separated from local practice deliberately, so that you see the center in benevolent terms, almost like an emperor that's aloof, a noble philosopher king, and then you have your local cadres doing either dirty work or just practical work. You see this in methods of protest. If you see protests against land grabs, you often see placards saying, please rescue us, referring to the center, to rescue us from corrupt cadres. So that is about legitimacy. It's not real. There's the dimension that this is about distance and institutional messiness, but it is also about presenting an image that Xi is aloof and doesn't get his hands dirty.
And I see Professor Millwood nodding his head at that. I don't know if he wants to add anything apart from the nodding head. Right. Anyhow, we're coming probably towards the end of time. And yes, Mr. Clark. Unmute, please.
I got automatically remuted again, which I didn't notice. Could I ask Dr. Zenz, please? One of the things in your paper you talk about, and it wasn't something in your presentation today, but the nature of, if you could say a bit more about the nature of the change in ethnic policy that Xi has brought in. My understanding before was that he had moved towards the second generation approach, and that it was towards the kind of, I think, colloquially known as Han chauvinism that Mao and others had opposed, and that it was philosophical, cultural change, as well as a sort of intensification of the anti-ethnic measures. But I think you're suggesting something slightly different, if I understand it.
Question of whether she, in fact, or China has in fact to the second generation of ethnic policy, I would say is debatable, and has been debatable already before this leak. There's by no means a unanimous agreement among scholars about the subject. Some scholars say yes, he has moved on, and some recent media reporting has taken certain changes in policy texts and statements to mean yes. Really, what the evidence simply shows a greater move towards assimilation and integration, which can easily be accomplished within the existing ethnic framework without moving on to a so-called second generation. Of course, this move might fulfill some of the demands made by the proponents of a second generation. Some of their demands might be met by a more assimilationist first ethnic policy. I am more tending towards the argument that China is maintaining its broader ethnic framework. I would have said as much before this document leak. And then within its existing ethnic policy framework, it is becoming gradually more assimilationist. Of course, in Xinjiang with a major shock and a spurt, in other parts of China with a more gradualist approach. But also if you observe developments in Tibetan region, etc. There's a general maintenance of the ethnic policy framework. It's being undermined maybe in some ways. I mean, the nominal ethnic distinction, the nominal autonomy, the nominal ethnic education system, some nominal preferential policies. There's a tweaking and a change, and there's a move towards certainly accommodating some of the demands. But now, I think, actually, it's interesting. You see a lot of repeating of Xi Jinping's demand to maintain China's ethnic policy. You see that, if you look for it, throughout Xinjiang documents and Chinese documents, actually. But now you can trace it back to a major, big top-level statement by Xi Jinping. And I was just, in my report to the Uyghur Tribunal, I was mentioning that because somebody could take that and accuse me of cherry picking and say, look, she actually says we should continue ethnic policy and we continue to have ethnic distinctions, etc. And it takes a long time for ethnic groups to dissolve and disappear, or religions. And I was kind of going to add that to my report and say this is not incompatible with mass atrocity or even genocide. This is not incompatible with what an ethnic group like the Uyghurs would consider a destruction of its own self. Because as some of the peer reviewers, including Dr. Tobin, have said very helpfully to me, just putting in concise words things that I've already been thinking and believing, that the ethnic framework itself serves the state and is used by the state to empty out and partially destroy and then rebuild ethnic identity.
Yes, Professor Milgood, yes.
As Dr. Zenz says, there is some academic disagreement on what has been going on with ethnic policy, first generation, second generation. And I certainly I like the way Dr. Zenz just put it just now. I mean, one point of difference is, or thing that should be clarified, is that I think Dr. Zenz is very skeptical about how pluralist even the first so-called first generation ethnic policy was in the first place, right? It was, its form has certain signals, you know, for example, talk about regional autonomy, which of course we always should put in quotation marks. It was never really autonomous or self-government and things like that. I think what happened around about 2014, there had been really a period of quite interesting open debate about ethnic policy in policy journals and academic journals, in party journals from 2008, 2009, and actually really going back to the early 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. But that debate was really quite open and surprising for a few years after 2008, 2009. And I think what happened is in 2014, Xi Jinping weighed in at a famous speech at an ethnic policy work forum. And he did a couple of things in that. One, he weighed in behind the form, the continued framework of what we call the first generation Minzu policy, which is what Dr. Zenz was just talking about. And so people were not going to stop identifying people by their ethnic group. They were not going to eliminate the names on the maps of Tibetan Autonomous Region, the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, things like that. They were going to continue to use this framework for governance. But at the same time, he signaled that big changes would be made. And one of those was that saying economic development alone is not going to address these problems of separatism. And we see that same comment in these current documents that we're talking about. And that put an end to the open debate about this question, as far as we know. It didn't, the famous articulators of the second generation thesis are still very much with us, and it's still in prominent positions. And so I think where we stand now, it's certainly not a repudiation of what they were saying. But I think she weighed in to simply say, we're going to continue with the forms, but then a lot has changed in the actual implementation, in the ramping up and intensification of assimilative tendencies that have been there all along.
Yes, Dr. Tobin, and then Ms. Rowe, and then we'll probably think of trying to draw this to a conclusion. Dr. Tobin.
I'll be brief. Yeah, it's worthwhile remembering the first and second generation debate was essentially about the best methods of assimilation. It wasn't an open debate where everyone could join in. There were no Uyghurs participating, there were no Tibetans and so forth. The first generation being historical materialists, saying development will gradually cause the identity to wither away. The second generation essentially saying, let's speed the process up. She obviously being, relying on Marxist legitimation symbols, can't say we're abandoning historical materialism. He's saying we are using historical materialism. But what he does, he taps into the chauvinism that was always there, that said the Han were formed thousands of years ago. They were always a socialist ethnic group, a socialist Minzu, that are above this framework of cultural evolution that is applied to Uyghurs and Tibetans, where their culture is seen as reflective of their natural material conditions. This is not applied to the Han. They are described as being formed thousands of years ago, before capitalism and all these things that are supposed to create these divisions. So she's essentially playing that balancing act, but it really does highlight that the notion of the need to assimilate was always there. She has just enacted policies to accelerate that.
Ms. Rowe?
Thank you very much, Dr. Zenz. I certainly found it very helpful that you have managed to make this evidence accessible to us and others. You mentioned, I think the phrase you used was the extreme significance of this evidence for making the link between presidency and policies on the ground, and you said especially on population optimization policies. And in the draft paper we've seen, there's the phrase from his May 2014 speech where he demanded birth control policies to be made equal for all ethnic groups. And then later on in the paper, you talk about the population optimization targets. And I just find it helpful if you could remind me what are the targets? Have they been quantified? Are they set out as a set of principles? It's just so I can understand what the link is between that statement of his in 2014 and where the situation, where the policies have got to over the years?
Sure. So we do not have, and I hope I didn't say that, we do not have a direct link between what Xi Jinping said and specific population optimization targets. What we have is that Xi Jinping said that population structure and security are crucial for stability maintenance and to equalize the birth control policies, and that these statements of his are then very quickly and subsequently found in statements, firstly by Liu Ele, who's both an academic and high-ranking official, are found in the document number 7, which spells out the population strategy, the strategy of the Bingtuan in southern Xinjiang, including population, and are found in key statements by academics, and are importantly found in key specific birth prevention targets and policies of Xinjiang government documents, such as the Family Planning and Health Commission document, but also in related mandates, for example, by local county family planning units and their targets. All of which quote literally one of the statements by Xi or both, refer to the context and spell out what it really means, that literally this means that we are suppressing Uyghur births with the goal of optimizing the population or balancing or making equal the population structure or growth, and also linking that to national security and stability considerations. So we are tracing several stages of evolution of linkages from Xi Jinping to document number 7, to statements such as the ones by Liu Ele and the academics between 2014 and 17, and then specific statements found in, for example, the 2019 document I quote from the Xinjiang Family Planning Unit, and then the actual empirical situation. Now, the wider long-term possible projections are my own inferences based on the combined evidence that I looked at in the first half of this year. Those longer-term possibilities and projections are inferences based on the evidence. If we look at the reality of the constraints and the situations, they cannot be directly traced to statements by Xi Jinping. But it's like a chain of thoughts and statements.
Okay, now I'm going to draw this to an end, but I have 2 questions for each of you gentlemen, which are probably very short in form and answer. And then I have a third question for Mr. Zenz. Let me just, Dr. Zenz, let me just explain that, as he knows about it. In London, when he was with Mr. Beckhamy, conversations occasionally were fairly casual. And at one moment, he said he'd had doubts about whether this was genocide. And I said to him, well, as soon as he said that, because that would be favorable to the PRC, I would have to ask him about it in public, so I'm going to ask him. The other 2 questions for all 3 of you. Is there any material in what you've seen showing any intention on the part of the PRC to eliminate, annihilate the Uyghurs, or even to kill them in any particular number? And then the second question for each of you is, one of the words we may have to consider, we do have to consider in a legal setting, is the word attack. And I'd just be interested to know, without you binding us or affecting us at all in the decisions we make, would you say that there is a state attack on the Uyghurs? And if so, how? So, Dr. Zenz, perhaps you just deal with the question about genocide first, and then with the other 2 questions, and then I'll ask Dr. Tobin and Professor Millward to give their answers to those 2 questions as well.
Yes. I was talking to the gentleman, Mr. Vetch and Mr. Nice, about the evolution in my thinking. That firstly, I noticed this decline in birth rates, but I wasn't sure why. Then the research showed there was a systematic campaign to suppress births, which was published in the middle of last year. Even so, until earlier this year, I had significant doubts about the question of intent, because I thought that we had virtually no empirical evidence of the intent behind birth prevention. And I had significant reservations about the question of determining genocide, because the question of intent is so significant behind a genocide determination, that making the key difference to, for example, crimes against humanity. This considerable uncertainty about the question of intent changed for me quite significantly with my research on discourses of population structure and optimization, and bringing together the different strands, which I presented at my first hearing and published academically in June this year. For me, these new findings on discourse of population optimization presented a feasible picture of a long-term plan to suppress births, which reflected the intent to optimize the population for the compelling and necessary and inevitable reason of maintaining Chinese national security. Quite a bit of that was based on inference. Even so, I now considered, starting in May and June, I considered that we now had a very good argument about intent, and I felt much more strongly about making a determination of genocide. Now, with this material, and this was part of the conversation also that we had in London, this material, at that time, of course, it was more potential, but now I'm quite certain this new material speaks very considerably to the question of intent, to the question of who is authorizing and wanting policies, including related to the population structure, making the considerations about long-term intent to suppress birth, control population growth, even much more clear. So this is the progression of my thinking.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's fine. Then evidence of any intention to kill, and then the question of attack.
Me answering first, or the two peers?
Yes, please, you go.
The question of a systematic attack against the Uyghur population became quite clear, especially from leaked documents such as the China cables in the Karakash list and other evidence. By early 2020, we had, I think, a compelling picture of a comprehensive attack against the Uyghur and other ethnic population in Xinjiang. I have always been skeptical on the question of systematic murder, and I continue to remain skeptical on the question of systematic large-scale killing or intentional killing, meaning murder. Although we do need to say there's considerable evidence for higher mortality, considerable evidence of deaths that happen through torture and other means in the camps. And we have considerable concern of subsequent survival rates of elites who have been sentenced to long prison terms. The taking out of the elite, sentencing many of the imams and the spiritual leaders and religious figures, etc., to 15, 20, 25-year prison terms. From everything we know, that's not dissimilar. That's quite close to a death sentence.
Thank you. Dr. Tobin.
Thank you. I don't focus on intent to kill, physically kill, but certainly from my work, I see the intent to annihilate a people. This is often termed as transformation. Now, if we go back to the original establishment of the regional autonomy system, this is described as needing to modernize those regions and those peoples. That in Chinese language, this also means sinicize. And then it's talked about as national unification. This doesn't just mean territorial control and then leave people to it. This means transformation of identity. It's always taught political stability is one thing, but the notion that this has always been about stability is not true. The language of transformation and modernization was always there, hence the debate we talked about over different methods of assimilation. This is just taken for granted that this is a good outcome, and there's no one to say otherwise. So that intent to annihilate is there, but obviously policy is then changed, which we're seeing more violent policies. The very language of Sinicization is, telling a people who do not see themselves as Chinese that they will be Sinicized. This is against their will. You can argue states do this, countries do this, we need a national language and so forth. That's fine, but you don't need to say Uyghurs are not a Turkic group, Uyghurs are not an Islamic group, and then round people up on those terms. So the Sinicization drive in principle is a form of annihilation, but it's also directed at very specific practices that Uyghurs rely on to maintain their community, specifically language and religion, but also what we presented in the first sessions about contact with your family and community, the severance of Uyghur diaspora from their homeland. Uyghurs talk about this, that itself is a practice of genocide. They cannot maintain their identity and their community. In terms of the state attack, yes, this is concerted and coordinated language policy to remove Uyghur language from the curriculum. This is talked about as modernization, it's talked about as a national security matter. This is in 2004, it's still talked about that way, as is religion. Population optimization narrative is all about national unity and security. It's not, the notion that there's a problematic population is not new. 2009 white papers were clear that ethnic dispersion was official policy. We just didn't have these types of documents outlining the detail, but it was stating concentrated ethnic populations are a security problem, specifically referring to ethnic minority regions, not Han regions. And this has infused the language of birth controls, why you would have birth controls in a region that has a very low population density, for example. So all of this is concerted, these related policies that in practice prevent Uyghurs from maintaining their identity in Xinjiang and outside, and it's seen as it's framed as national security and survival of China. The 2009 analysis was referred to as the violence was referred to as a life or death struggle against terrorism, and this includes people who want to maintain Turkic language or practice Islam.
Thank you. Professor Mill, would you get the last word today?
I've increasingly come to see the situation in Xinjiang, really since 1949, as one of settler colonialism. And it really is a classic case. And one of the things about settler colonialism, of course, is that the people who are there, the indigenous people, become an obstacle to the goals of the colonizing power, right? And so there's a security component of this, and obviously we hear so much about dangers of separatism from that. And then there's also a developmental way, a way in which the indigenous people are seen as an obstacle developmentally. And both of those concerns increasingly came into play after 2009 with the riots, and of course, particularly in 2013 and from 2013 through 2014-15 with the obvious terrorist attacks. And so I, like my colleagues, don't see a direct state intent to physically kill, murder masses of Uyghur people. But I see very, very clear intent to try to make this problem go away through assimilation, through attack on Uyghur-ness, if not entirely on Uyghurs themselves, with the important caveat that one of the results of mass internments and so on is going to be increased mortality, as Dr. Zenz just said. And so we can see very clearly outlined in these documents and as effects of the policy, and even in public documents and statements in the press, in the Chinese state media, attacks on identity, attacks on language, on family, on community, on religion, the particular zeal with which graveyards and cemeteries have been razed to the ground. We focused more on mosques, I think, perhaps because they're more prominent architectural features. But the concern to go out and pave over graveyards and put a parking lot there, which has been documented in many places, that is deliberately getting at roots of culture, getting at community sources of identity. And so, and then of course, there is also labor transfer and diffusion of the population and birth suppression, which is trying to simply make there be fewer Uyghurs in southern Xinjiang, and in general. And so I guess I would say it is definitely an attack on Uyghurness, an attempt to eliminate the obstacles to the state program, developmental, and also what's perceived as a dangerous security threat, which Uyghurness itself is seen to present to the Chinese state.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to wind things up. I will give Mr. Vetch a chance to see if there's anything that he's been so involved in all this that he wants to add. But just as a matter of formality, I have to record that our 9th tribunal, Professor Lynch, was unable to join today. He will, of course, be able to watch the totality of this on record. And if he has any questions, I'll ask him to see if you can indulge us with them in writing. Second thing that I need to make clear for those viewing is that not only, gentlemen, have you all responded at great speed to our request for assistance, but that all the work has been done pro bono publico. And that's an extremely impressive contribution to the exercise in which we've all been engaged. Before I wish you good night or good morning for Dr. Zenz and Professor Mould, sorry, Mr. Vetch, anything you want to add?
No, Sir Geoffrey.
In which case, I'm going to ask the three of you to leave so that it can be quite clear that there's been no further discussion between the tribunal and the three witnesses. We may now stay on to speak amongst ourselves, but thank you again for turning up. And if you'd be good enough now to bid us farewell, enjoy the weekend if there's any of it left.
And Geoffrey, I just